All right, so today, dancers, we're going to be talking about postmodern dance. And first of all, I think it would be good to really define what is postmodernism. Well, postmodernism, a late 20th century philosophy and concept in the arts, dance, architecture, and criticism that represents a departure from modernism and has at its heart a general distrust of grand theories and ideologies. So think about Graham, think about Humphrey Wideman, think about Holme, and how entrenched they were in their ideas about what they were doing was right. I mean, when you really think of it, modern dance started as a rebellion against ballet. And now, as it's grown and developed, we now have a rebellion against the rebellers, right? So that's what's happening here. So postmodernism is a movement characterized by broad skepticism. That's key. Broad skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an accurate sensitivity to the role of ideal. So an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. So if you have something, if there is something that exists, there's an ideology behind it. And that's there in order to maintain somebody in power. So there is this notion of anti-authoritarianism, like a refusal to recognize the authority of any single style or definition of what art should be. Again, think Graham, think Humphrey Wideman, think Holme. What did they think art should be? They certainly had notions about what they believed it should be. And postmodernism just rejects concepts of rationality, objectivity, universal truth. It doesn't exist to them. Instead, it emphasizes this diversity of human experience and a multiplicity of perspectives. It's this notion, it's about the experience, the truth of the moment, and including multiple perspectives into that idea, so that no one holds truth, but that truth is an amalgamation of ideas. For them, postmodernism is about trying to be real and not putting on pretenses, not acting like you have all the answers, but rather asking questions. And the point is to ask and question everything. Don't be pretentious, just be real. That's what postmodernism is about. The backdrop of this perspective was what was going on at the time. And if we look, this radical new perspective didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a reaction to the signs of the times. There was the Vietnam War. It was raging and developing. It was by 1960s that we were just starting to get into it. It had been going on before then, but the United States got into it, and they executed a draft. So if you were over 18 and you were male, you were forced to go into the military, even if you didn't want to be in the military. So that's what the draft is. And people were, if your number came up, you had to go. And so people were in the streets burning their draft cards. They were also burning the American flag. They were protesting the war across on the other side of the world in Vietnam. And the war in Vietnam, I would say, was probably an outgrowth of the Cold War. It was this fear of communism, this fear that was spreading, and we were trying to place a check on the northern Viet Cong that were to stop them from the communists taking over the country and any more further spread of this communist ideals. But not only was, so these, there were huge protests against the Vietnam War. When soldiers would come back from, they would come back in body bags, and their families were mourning. You'd have protesters that were shouting at the mourners. So it was not, but then also you had, so it was tough. It was really tough. So the Vietnam War was happening, and there was major protests. There was also the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement was taking off, and they were practicing acts of civil disobedience, non-violent protests like sit-ins, and they were just being beaten down. Places like Birmingham marched from Selma to Montgomery and attacked by the police and the authorities. It was brutal. The police and the authorities would shoot at them with clubs and bullets and setting churches on fire, and they were hitting them with fire hoses and sicking dogs on people. It was terrible. I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington in New York City. Big events, big movements for equal and civil rights. Women's rights were also being emphasized during this time. Up into this point, into the 60s, women were relegated to like being the housewife. But now they were moving up in their private and their professional lives. And this book by Betty Friedman called The Feminine Mystique, it looked at the role of personal and professional freedom for women, looking at so that women could have sex and enjoy it rather than it being a duty of some kind. Roe versus Wade came out during this time. The pill came out during this time. So contraception and then the legalizing of contraception came out during this time. There was also the hippie movement. So counterculture. It was a whole counterculture that really didn't trust, authority in any way, shape, or form. So they were just trying to experience, and they had this huge social revolution of trying to experience life and to be real and not put on any sort of ideology. So it was a rejection of what establishment was. So you had huge gatherings of people for free love and peace and representing all of it in Woodstock was what happened here. And then also there was the printing of ancient Chinese texts and Japanese texts called like the I Ching was one, the Book of Changes. And you had people practicing Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion became really popular in the West. So transcendental meditation became a huge movement. Zen Buddhism was a big movement in this era. It became very popular, still is popular. Gay rights. So there was this place called, in New York City, the Stonewall Inn, where men would go to meet up with one another. And police always raided that place. They raided it hard. They came down really hard with billy clubs and just brutally attacking and, coming in and arresting and humiliating the men that got together there. And so there was a moment in the 60s where they said, no way, we're not going to put up with this nonsense. And they rioted. They went in the streets. It was called the Stonewall Riots. And it was one of the very first protests for LGBT rights. And it started there in New York City. the stone wall in. There was many other, but that was one of the big ones. So this was going on. There was also and of all these things that I've just listed, Vietnam War, the civil rights, the women's rights, all of this was going on. And the backdrop of all of that was also like the high stakes of it, were this constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union and the United States had enough nukes to wipe everybody off the planet. And there was tension between these countries, so much so that we were worried, that people were frightened that someone was going to push the button and it was going to be a nuclear holocaust. So there was this fear in the United States of communism that I mentioned. So in 1961, the CIA banded together with a bunch of rebels on the island of Cuba, which is, just off the coast of Florida, and there's a communist stronghold there in Cuba. Fidel Castro was running this government, and so the United States decided to try to overthrow it through the act of working with the CIA to empower these rebels to overthrow the Fidel Castro's government, and it failed. It failed miserably, but it increased the tension so much so that there was this huge missile crisis that happened. It escalated to the point where the nuclear bombs almost started going. Like Russia was sending bombs like the Soviet Union was sending bombs to Cuba, to have nuclear bombs pointed at United States cities right off the coast of America was a big deal. And we were this close to a nuclear war. We really were. There were also, during this time, this era, just painting the picture, the space race was going on. Still an extension of the Cold War that was still very happening, very, very much going on. 1969, Neil Armstrong's walking on the moon. So getting people, but there was a race to get there, to get someone, in space, into orbit, so this space race was on. There were major improvements in technology, and all of that was happening. All this was going on. And then there was also the assassinations. There were several, but two of the major ones. John F. Kennedy, our president, was assassinated in 1963. And then Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Devastating actions that just affected everybody in the country. But also, behind all of, there was corruption going on. Not everything was hunky-dory. Everything was, 1974, there's the Watergate scandal. President Nixon has just been forced to resign because of, he was impeached. The Watergate scandal, where he sent people in to investigate the Democratic National Convention and just broke into the offices. So Nixon was scandalized in that and had to resign. Corruption didn't just happen here in the United States. It wasn't just isolated to the things here. China, in particular, was undergoing its own cultural revolution during all of this time. Mao Zedong, communist leader and dictator, was getting rid of the old ways, clearing out. He was putting people in prison. Like if you spoke English, if you owned land, anything, they would put you in prison for those things and re-educate you through labor and starvation. 20 million people died in China due to the Cultural Revolution, the Cultural landmarks were destroyed. I mean, so people were questioning why. Why is all this corruption? Why is all this killing? Why aren't people being able to have equal rights? What's going on? Why can't people love one another? I mean, the 60s and 70s were just decades of change and turmoil. And modern dancers took chances, and they changed, and they moved away from the formalism of the 1950s, and they tried to get to the essence of the things that mattered to them. All of these things. The things that mattered. They wanted their work to be honest, and not full of drama, not full of symbolism. They didn't want to say they had all the right answers. They didn't know how to solve all these problems. But they had questions, and they wanted to ask them with their movement and with their choreography. And so the modern dancers adapted and changed. So, this book here is a really good one. It's by Sally Baines, and it's called Terpsichore Sneakers, Postmodern Dance, and it's a great book on what's happening during this era. It chronicles a lot of the dancers and the people that were part of this movement. And if you're interested at all in this philosophy, the philosophy behind the movement, if you're interested at all in the dancers, this gives you more information about that, and I highly recommend the book. But so let's talk about what some of the philosophical ideas are behind postmodernism. One of those is deconstruction. So similar to what Alvin Nikolai had talked about with deconstructionism, in other words, taking this whole dramatic theme and breaking it into parts, this is similar to that, but even on a more extreme level. So deconstruction for the postmodern era is about an analysis that questions everything about a performance event. Any presuppositions that you might have. What are the ideological underpinnings? What are the hierarchical values? What's the structure and the frames of reference? Who's seeing what? So there's this just gets to the heart of the mistrust of ideology or any established norm. So why are things the way they are? And who does it benefit to keep things the way they are? And who is being left out? And whose perspective are we missing? So these are the big questions that these dancers are trying to ask and try to answer. You know, they're looking for answers. Also, post-structuralism. This emphasizes the various aspects of a particular culture, our culture. From the most ordinary, everyday details, just analyzes them, to the most abstract theories and beliefs that determine one another. So, looking at everything, being able to analyze everything. Why is the structure the way it is? So, it's based in it's being critical of absolutist ideals, claiming that truth is based on circular reasoning, that it's important to uncover the hidden patterns of circularity, paradox, and event. So we'll talk about that. They connected their observations and references from various experience and disciplines to a synthetic amalgamation of ideas. So this circular reasoning, there's an example of that is like, you look up democracy in the dictionary, and what you get are words like representation, power, freedom. But then, if you go and you look up the words representation, power, and freedom, then you might end up you'll get other words, and those words, you look up those definitions, and you'll get you'll eventually get back to democracy as a definition. So in a sense, you're using the subject of the question to answer the question you're asking in the first place. So it's kind of a circular reasoning. And the choreographers of this era just mistrusted representation. They mistrusted spectacle. Anything you put a fancy spot on, why is it fancy? Why do you want us to look there? What's going on? So they thought that by deconstructing ideas or concepts or movement, that they'd be able to see more clearly what life is all about. So they stripped away the structure of the dances that they were making. They exposed how the dancers were created and took away the mystery. And they tried for a more honest statement. They were more concerned with the movement itself, rather than expressing or communicating feelings or portraying specific characters in a story. They weren't trying to tell any story. They were just trying to be. See, stories and characters and all that's loaded down with other concepts and ideologies and status quo and, and who does all that benefit? So the idea is really just exposing what they're doing, trying to be transparent. So they eliminated the idea of formal dance technique, and instead they chose natural movements, walking, running, skipping, hopping. And some just flat out refused to work with any formally trained dancers. And they took their performance to other spaces. They found alternative performance spaces to do their work. Some of the characteristics that you'll find in postmodern dance are these. You'll find embracing everyday pedestrian movements as valid performance art. Like I was saying, walking, skipping, running. These are all valid ways of moving and performing, and natural as well. Movement repetition becomes something that you do. You see it again. Maybe you can look at it from a different perspective, like seeing it over and over again. You get another chance to see it. Uninfected dynamics. So one thing is not more important than anything else. By keeping it all the same, there's no dynamic range. It's all the same. Why does anything have to be more important than anything else? And there doesn't have to be a beginning, and there doesn't have to be an end. There's a notion, especially out of like this transcendental meditation, a beginning with no beginning. It's just like it starts because it's already started. The notion of something is already happening because it had no beginning, and it will have no end. It'll just continue on. This continuation of things. The dancers during this time used props. They tried to recontextualize things that we see in our everyday life and put them in a new place so that we could look at them in a new way. Props helped you do that. Alternative performance sites. So they went everywhere for their dancing, putting dance where it doesn't belong. They put dance in crazy places, in places that aren't set up for performance events. Pedestrian movement. They just, we talked about that. Minimal movement. What little can we do in some ways? How simple can it be? Mathematical structures formed the basis of the form in some ways, because you could just be pure, or it would take your choosing out of it and make it just a mathematical random sequence. The rejection of theatrical staging, so no more proscenium arches. What's the point of that? Why does the audience have to sit down low in the house while the dancers are elevated on some stage? What makes the dancers any better than the audience members? So they rejected theatrical staging. And the focus was rather on the process instead of the product. It's the making of the thing that is the most important. And so if all of this is the context in which we're working, well then, here we go. Everything is a dance, and nothing is a dance. Walking on buildings is dance. Pedestrian movement is dance. Giving blood on stage is dance. Leaping out of a 6th-story window to your death is a dance. Putting on and taking off clothing is a dance. Non-dancers can dance. And the dead can dance. In short, a marketing problem the dance community will never recover from. Similar to Cunningham and Nicolai, the dancers of the postmodern era eliminated the idea of theme and storyline in their work. And they also eliminated the idea of formal technique, choosing to walk and choosing to run and skip and hop. And they refused to work with trained dancers. Even though some of them were trained dancers, they tried to eliminate that aspect of what they were doing. And the dancers they chose to work with them didn't have to be trained formally. And then escalating rents for rehearsal studios and theaters and other performance venues also, the economics of that really helped to push them out of the performance space and into alternative spaces. So dance was presented in lofts, in warehouses, garages, empty swimming pools, fields, ponds, woods, anywhere they could find open space. Choreographers frequently, they also performed, they even frequently presented rehearsals as performances. Because remember, it's the process, not the product, that's important. So they're trying to pull back the curtain and show you what they're doing. Now, where did all this start? Was there any kind of movement to get them going? Who guided them in this direction? And when we trace it back, it really comes down to Robert and Judith Dunn, I would say. The beginnings of what we will know as Judson Dance Theatre can be traced back to the 1960s here, when Judith Dunn, who was a Cunningham dancer, and her husband, Robert Ellis Dunn, who was a musician and composer, the two of them began to give composition classes at the Merce Cunningham Dance Studios. Now, Robert Dunn had studied music composition with John Cage, and he had worked as an accompanist for Graham and for Cunningham. And so they had been around a lot of that. And they decided to create these composition classes. And so Robert and Judith gave these composition classes, and they were experimental in nature. And they had a strong basis in improvisation and analysis of composition. They were given in response to people seeking new structures with which to explore movement. The participants solved movement problems, and they were encouraged to experiment and to develop some kind of a new style of dance, to really look at dance in a new way. They found ways to take control out of the equation, like Cunningham. The dancers responded to their environment, similar to like Cage. If, in the midst of a dance that's happening somewhere there, and someone in the audience puts their hand on their hip or wears a hat or does, just holds books in their arms or does something, well, whatever it is, that could cause a change in the dance itself. It could cause the dancers to do something differently. So other things like in their environment, like traffic lights or radio announcements or the wind in the trees or, people wearing or not wearing hats or colored clothing. It doesn't matter. The events around, so in the midst of their dancing, while they're performing, if something happens, it could affect what's going on in the dance. So they're taking control out of the equation, in other words. Now, some of the dancers that are that were in this composition class that are names that you should know are Yvonne Rainer, Trisha Brown, Steve Paxton, David Gordon, Lucinda Childs, Meredith Monk, and Deborah Hay. All of these dancers, there were others. These dancers were kind of like the premier. These dancers were the ones that went on and made a career, their career, they had lasting, long careers in their own ways. And when people think of the Judson Dance Theatre, it's these people that they tend to point to. Yvonne Rainer, Trisha Brown, Steve Paxton in particular, those three. Then David Gordon, Meredith Monk, Deborah Hay, Lucinda Childs. Yeah, all of these dancers. So they're good people to get to know, and each of them has their own history. We'll look a little bit further, even next week, into more about Trisha Brown. And I want to look at a lot of them today, so a few of them today. But let's talk about the Judson Dance Theatre. So it was here at the Judson Memorial Church, which was an activist church in Washington Square, New York City, known for its support of activist movements like the civil rights movement, the women's rights movements, the gay rights movement, the protests in Vietnam, all of that this church was sympathetic to. And the group of dancers who performed there became known as the Judson Dance Theatre, because they were a part of this they were performing at the Judson Memorial Church, so they were the Judson Dance Theatre. The dancers were determined to reject the conventional teachings of their predecessors, like Cunningham, like Graham, like Home, like Humphrey Whiteman. And the church provided a space, a safe space for rehearsals and performances. And so other artists joined them. So visual artists, writers, musicians, as well as other dancers, they all came together and they presented different types of material that they called dance. But they called it dance, but then they also they got hung up on that notion of it being called dance, because they wanted to call it other things as well. Because it's more than just dance. It was a performance event. It was a performance art. It was a happening. It was all kinds of things that were going on there. So they were meeting. But the church, the Judson Memorial Church, it gave them a place for rehearsing and for showing the work from their composition class. And at first, the Judson Dance Theatre was ignored by the press, but they had such a strong and consistent following of people who would come out to watch their works. The initial group produced at least 20 concerts before moving on in their separate ways. And you can still go to the Judson Memorial Church and watch dance performance events. But the first piece, which was done in July 6, 1962, was one of Dunn's composition students. This was their first performance event. It was 3 hours long. It was middle of July. It was sweltering heat, 90 degrees. Over 300 people packed into the basement of the church to watch this performance. There was no air conditioning. And they stayed. And it was experimental. And there was this atmosphere of diversity, freedom, and interest in like a new movement happening here. So the company went on, Judson Dance Theatre ultimately continued to produce over 20 concerts there at the Judson Dance Theatre. But they also performed in lots of other places too, like stage, lots of places that didn't have proscenium arches or stages. Places like gymnasiums and on the city streets or in stairwells around the city, on fire escapes, on barges floating in the river, or, even on rooftops. And we'll look at some of that. Many of the Judson choreographers have participated in what's called happenings. These were also going on in the city, like in Central Park and in various, empty lots around the city, and out in the, surrounding areas around Manhattan as well. Happenings were events. They were performances that combined elements of dance and theater and music and poetry and music and, and visual arts that sort of blur the boundaries between life and art, and they forged new paths for these artistic practices, random, crazy things that would happen. And, performance events that you had to be there to see because they weren't going to last. And they kind of destroyed themselves within the performance. They would make a sculpture out of ice, or they would pop balloons, or they would, things that would. It's great. You gotta go and look up descriptions of happenings in the 1960s and 70s to see what some of the crazy things they were doing. But the Judson dancers brought their ideas of improvisational, spontaneous, and collaborative work and taking risks in dance to these events. And so the happenings, they were doing them. So they continued to do them. And the dancers brought the ideas of the happenings into what they were doing as well. So they collaborated. Here's some imagery. So this is the group of the first company, Judson Dance Theatre. I think they're on some mattresses there. And they have some ropes, and I don't know what they're doing. Just piled on top. This is Robert Rauschenberg was one of the artists who was working with them, and this is one of his constructions, and roller skating, and with the parachute thing behind her. Several images of them dancing in small spaces, confined space, finding alternative spaces to dance. Just more imagery. Let's look at her, Yvonne Rainer. Yvonne was born in San Francisco. This picture here is a book, Feelings Are Facts of Life. It's a life. This is her autobiography, Feelings Are Facts. It's a great book. I highly recommend picking up this text on Yvonne Rainer. She's amazing. Really incredible person. And was really one of the forerunners of the Judson era. Yvonne Rainer was born in San Francisco. She studied with Martha Graham and with Merce Cunningham in New York City in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, she also studied with Anna Halprin. I didn't mention Anna Halprin. Anna Halprin, she was out on the West Coast in San Francisco and had her own sense of community-based work and happenings going on out there. She was doing work that was experimental, taking off of clothes and putting on clothes and looking at nature and getting into, taking dance out into the beaches and out into the woods and into the mud. And she was doing all kinds of wonderful things and she really inspired a whole generation of dancers herself. So Anna Halprin was a teacher, and she influenced many of the Judson Church dancers as well. So, so Anna Halprin. So Yvonne Rainer studied with Anna Halprin, also with Martha Graham and with Cunningham. She was a founding member of the Judson Dance Theatre, and ultimately she went on and started the Grand Union. Now, we haven't talked about the Grand Union. The Grand Union started in the 70s, and it grew out of Yvonne Rainer's dance company and what she called her continuous project. altered daily. The Grand Union became an improvisational dance group in New York City. It started out as really Yvonne's company, but then the company members really wanted it to be more their work, or the work of the dancers themselves. It became kind of a dance collective. And many of the dancers from the Judson Dance Theatre were also members of the Grand Union. So we'll see that. And like David Gordon is one of those dancers. And he was one of the original dancers of the Judson Dance Theatre, and he was also a dancer in the Grand Union. He created a piece called the Chair Piece that is very famous. But he said in an article about, when he was interviewed about the Grand Union, he said an audience of about 200 people would show up. And after the first hour, there was approximately 100 for these. So the Grand Union gave these like 2-hour performances. And so he said, an audience of about 200 people would show up for the performance. And after the first hour, there was approximately 150 people left. And after the second half hour, there were about 100 people left. And by the time the performance ended, there was somewhere between 12 and 20 people left. And those people who stayed around to the end asked us where we were going to go next. And so, you don't know what this means to us out there, they said. You don't know what you've done. You've changed our lives. And so David Gordon was saying, it took me a while to understand that if 180 people walk out of our performance, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. If there's 20 people left who had had the best time of their lives. So this is like, what is the perspective that we're looking at? The alternative perspectives. Whose perspective should we be prioritizing? Should we be prioritizing and entertaining the 180 people? Or should we be just really changing the lives of these 20 people? You know, that's the kind of perspective they're having with the work that they're doing. And Yvonne Rainer was all about that. So she did these happenings every day. She did this altered daily thing that she was doing. Yvonne's work emphasizes human interaction between the performer and the audience. Like she was a minimalist artist, and she used repetition, employed some narrative to engage with the audience, but used she minimalized even the narrative and the verbal noises that she would make, down to grunts and wails and mumbles and squeaks and things. She's really concerned with the creative process itself and reducing dance down to a minimum, without emotion, without theatricality, without spectacle of any kind. For her, the creative process is the product. Let me say that again. The creative process is the product. Yvonne Rainer. That's important. She also created many film works. Like she's created over 7 full-length films. And she's still active today. She's choreographed a work. Her most famous work, perhaps, is called Trio A. And in this work, that she made in 1966, it's a movement phrase that's really stripped down to its bare essentials. There's no dynamic changes throughout this piece. No movement is more important than another. It's all treated about the same. Even though some of the movements are difficult to execute, but the dancers didn't really have to be trained to perform them. Everyone could do it. It's acceptable for audience members to witness dancers struggling with the dance and working it out. But that alone, the working out of the balance is beautiful, is interesting. So Yvonne Rainer also used this dance as a protest against the Vietnam War. She got lots of people to do this dance, not just dancers. Many, many people danced this dance. And I left a link to it so you could see it in the in Moodle, in the online. I posted it for you so you could see it. And in 1967, in an article for Drama Review, she wrote what came to be known as the No Manifesto. And this was the manifesto for the Judson Dance Theatre. It became their mission statement. It explained what they were trying to do with dance. Although they had trouble with the label dance, but this became their manifesto. And I'll read it to you right now. The No Manifesto. It said no to spectacle, no to virtuosity, no to transformations and magic and make-believe, no to the glamour and transcendence of the star image, no to the heroic, no to the anti-heroic, no to trash imagery, no to involvement of the performer or spectator, no to style, no to camp, no to seduction of the spectator by the wiles of the performer, no to eccentricity, and no to moving or being moved. And I would like to know what you think of this in your writing, like in your reflection. I would really love to know your thoughts on the No Manifesto, a very important manifesto and mission statement, really, of the Judson era. Oh dear, let me go on. Sorry about that. Trisha Brown. Let's go on to Trisha Brown. She was born in Wilmington, Delaware in 1936. And she also studied with Anna Halprin and as a dance major at Mills College. And she moved to New York City in 1960 and was a founding member of the Judson Dance Theatre. And then in 1970, she was also part of the Grand Union. She creates works in cycles, so she makes work over time, exploring movement over ideas over multiple pieces, 3 pieces. And she's known for being rigorously cerebral in her approach to dance. So she thinks about what she's doing. Just because you're improvising doesn't mean you're turning off your brain. Just because you're dancing doesn't mean you turn it off. She created many complex choreographic works by using the acts of repetition. Simple movement patterns were developed and repeated in several different ways, such as changing the direction, or the level, or the timing of the movement, turning the simple, fundamental motor patterns that everybody does into visually complicated dances. And she did end up creating movement patterns that seemed to develop logically from one movement to the next, like accumulation pieces. She made pieces that built upon one another. And today, the Trisha Brown Dance Company still performs worldwide. One of the most respected companies out there. Her company and her most famous works, I would say, exploited the architecture of the environment around her in her equipment pieces. She danced on rooftops, on rafts floating on a lake, on the sides of buildings. She gave us Man Walking Down Side of Building in 1970, and that was exactly what it sounds like. And it was performed in New York City with people looking up from the street to see what the action was. Yeah, here's some imagery. Now this is rooftop piece, and you see here, there's a person here in the foreground, and this person can really only see this person over here. Yeah. And that person can really only see this person over here, in the center in the back. and that person can really only see this person way over here, or whatever, you know. So this stretched all the way across Manhattan. People placed at intervals all along, like 5 miles across Manhattan and 22 miles long. I mean, this piece was incredible. That they were dancing and moving in unison all the way across the city, just barely within the reach of their own vision, right? Pretty incredible. Another work, this is man walking down the side of a building, even though this is not a man, nor is it a building, but nonetheless, it's based on the same idea. But yeah, using ropes, she was able to do this. Really incredible work. And the last person I'm going to talk about today is Steve Paxton. Steve Paxton, I've had that opportunity to dance with him and to study from him. He studied at, he grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and studied at the American Dance Festival when it was at Connecticut College. And he made his way to New York City in the late 1950s. He studied and he danced with Jose Lamon and with Merce Cunningham. He was a dancer in both of their companies, and he attended Robert Dunn's choreography course at the Cunningham Studios. And his association with Yvonne Rainer and Robert Rauschenberg led to his involvement in the formation and in, he helped to form this Judson Dance Theatre. But Steve Paxton is probably best known for developing contact improvisation. He had studied the Japanese martial art form Aikido and used it as a foundation for developing contact improvisation. He had, like all the other Judson dancers, he had explored pedestrian movement using improvisation and games. But he took it even to another level with his students at Oberlin College. In early 1972, he started experimenting with gravity. And his early performance events there with the students at the college became something known as magnesium. And that was the basis for forming contact improvisation. And now he won't claim it's not Steve Paxton. Contact improvisation is not Steve Paxton technique, but it was the practice he developed, and everyone knows it. Everyone points to him as the choreographer, the founder of it. But he won't claim it. He won't say, "Oh yeah, that contact improvisation, that's mine," just because that's an ideology. That's something that he doesn't want to be. He doesn't have all the answers to contact improvisation. Contact improvisation is a practice. It's a study. It's a form of dance that can be it's a social event. It's a dance sport. It's a jam session. It's something that's in practice that you do. It's something you study. It's not something you have, or, oh, I've learned that, now I can do it. It's something that you continually do. So, he didn't really use contact improvisation in his choreography, but many practitioners of contact improvisation did. They went on to use contact improv in their choreography. He just chose not to. He had a long solo performance career. And some of his choreography, like Flat, which he made in 1964, or Satisfying Lover in 1967, those are some of the things that he choreographed. Just a little bit more about, since then he's really left the performance world. He now he writes for Contact Improvisation, for Contact Quarterly, which is a magazine. Contact Quarterly is a periodical that comes out every quarter that interviews and has poetry and images of people who are dancing contact improvisation all over the world. It's a really great, I highly recommend you subscribing to this magazine. Contact improvisation is a great technique theory. It's based in physical space and the use of the floors and the walls and the chairs and the props for people for initiating weight transfers and counterbalance and trust exercises and rolling and falling and lifting. And it's you establish a point of contact and you roll with it and you go where it can take you. There are definite techniques and skills involved with it, but you don't have to be a technically trained ballet dancer to do contact improvisation. It's got like functional skills that it develops in the people and improvisational skills. So Steve Paxton is the founder of that form. And Fall After Newton is a video that I put in the online that I'd love you to see. It details his exploration in the 1970s and development of the form. Really good. And so next week we're going to look at Twyla Tharp and Trisha Brown again. We might mention her, and then Palabolas. So we're going to look at some other dancers, and then hopefully by now you're also starting to think about your papers and getting your ideas of the choreographers that you would like to write about. So I'm looking forward to reading those. I'm looking forward to talking more with you. Thank you very much for listening for tonight and for today. And take care.